The summer moon rose over Wren's Hollow, soft and swollen like a lantern cupped in trembling hands. The village was asleep beneath it, save for the fires still licking at the charred bones of the outer barns. The air smelled of smoke and iron, and somewhere in the dark, wolves were still howling. 7-year-old Alina Morrow crouched on the edge of the well, clutching a ragged doll by its limp arm. The adults had hidden inside the chapel. The younger children had been told not to look outside, not to breathe too loud. But Alina had always been too curious, too restless for silence. From where she sat, she could see the border ridge, a low, silver-backed line that separated their world from his. The night court, the villagers called it, with a mix of awe and venom. A kingdom of predators who ruled when mortals slept. A land that swallowed the stars. Tonight he had come from there, the vampire king. The first time she saw him, he was standing on the ridge like a statue carved from midnight. His cloak moved though there was no wind, and his eyes, God's his eyes, glowed faintly red, like embers buried deep in snow. The men had dropped their torches when he appeared. Even the wounded stopped groaning. Only the fires dared make noise. He didn't speak at first. He simply watched, his expression unreadable, as 2 of his knights dragged the bodies of the rogue vampires, the ones who had broken his laws, to the center of the square. They looked like young men, not monsters. Pale, shivering, their throats already half burned by sunlight exposure. The villagers murmured prayers. Alina's mother pulled her closer, whispering, "Don't look at him. Don't ever look a vampire in the eyes." But Alina couldn't help it. She peeked between her mother's arms and saw something no one else seemed to notice. The king looked tired. Not angry, not hungry, just impossibly tired. When he finally spoke, his voice carried like wind through hollow wood. "They broke the treaty. The penalty is final." The 2 vampires cried out, not words, just the sound of desperation. A flick of his hand, and the air itself seemed to burn. The rogues fell, their bodies turning to dust before they hit the ground. No one breathed. When it was done, the king turned to leave. His knights melted into the darkness behind him. That should have been the end of it. But Alina, trembling and barefoot, slipped free of her mother's grip and ran. The villagers gasped as the child darted across the ashes. Her little feet left prints in the soot. "Alina!" her mother cried, horrified. The vampire king paused mid-step, his head turning slowly. For a heartbeat, the whole world seemed to hold its breath. Alina stopped a few feet from him, panting. She was shaking so hard her knees nearly gave out, but her eyes, large and bright as 2 moons, didn't look away. "You're not scary," she said, voice small but steady. A ripple of disbelief went through the crowd. One of the knights hissed under his breath, "Child, silence!" But Caleb, the king, lifted a hand to stop him. He studied the girl. Up close, he saw the dirt smudged across her face, the torn hem of her dress, the way she clutched a doll with one missing button eye. A mortal child. Fragile, defiant, and utterly unafraid. Her pulse thrummed audibly in the air between them. He knelt so they were eye level. "Not scary." His voice softened, the faintest trace of confusion in it. "Do you know what I am?" Alina nodded. "You're the king of the night court. And yet you stand before me. I wanted to see what? If monsters get lonely too," he blinked. For the first time in centuries, the king had no answer. Behind him, the wind stirred, carrying the scent of smoke and lavender. For a fleeting instant, the moonlight touched his face, not cruel, not cold, and she saw sadness there. He straightened slowly. "You should be afraid of me, little one." "I'm not," she said, chin tilted up. "Because I'm going to marry you one day, and then you won't be lonely anymore." The silence that followed was so pure it almost hurt. His knights shifted uncomfortably. The villagers watched from the shadows, expecting her to be struck down or worse. But the vampire king laughed, quietly. Not mockery, something deeper, something that almost sounded human. He reached out, brushing a strand of ash from her hair. His touch was cool but careful, as if he feared she might break. "Perhaps," he murmured, "when the moon forgets the sun." Then he turned. His cloak billowed behind him like a piece of the night tearing loose. Alina watched him go, her small hand clutching the doll so tight its seams split. He vanished into the tree line, his knights following, silent as mist. Only his final words lingered, carried by the wind. Keep your courage, little one. The world will need it. That night, long after the ashes cooled, Alina sat on the ridge where he had stood. The stars blinked uncertainly, as if unsure what they had just witnessed. She whispered into the dark as though he could still hear her. "I'll be your queen one day, you'll see." And far beyond the ridge, in a palace of obsidian and sorrow, the vampire king paused in his steps. For reasons he did not understand, his ancient heart gave a single, unfamiliar ache. In the centuries that followed, he would forget faces, wars, names, but not that voice, not that promise made beneath a blood-bright moon. The night court did not announce itself with trumpets. It revealed itself the way a long winter reveals itself, slowly, inevitably, until one morning the world is already cold. From the valley below, the palace of Kael Varen rose like a black wave. Towers of polished marble that drank the moonlight instead of throwing it back, banners the color of dried blood, spires carved with the sigils of vanished houses. Lanterns hung from iron arms along the approach. Their flames were small and blue, as if the night itself had learned to keep a human temper. Alina arrived by cart, not by choice. The road into the court was lined with soldiers whose faces were pale in the light, and their armor made the sound of winter when they moved. Men in cloaks watched from behind the pillars of the outer gate, eyes keen, hands ready. Chains clinked like the teeth of a clock. She had not been prepared for the way the court swallowed sound. Even the human voices that rose in protest as the wagon rolled past were compressed into a distant, underwater hum. Inside the courtyard, the air smelled of cold iron and wilted roses. A hush sat like ash. People had come to see the spectacle, traders, nobles, and a smattering of those who trafficked in rumor. They leaned in to witness what the night court did when it chose a human life. Alina's wrists were bound with silver-forged shackles that bit into her skin with a hunger the blacksmith had been paid to make. The chain across her shoulders was ornamented with hammered sigils, triangles and moons that meant law. When she shifted, combustion hissed faintly, and the metal left a ghost smell of static against her bones. These irons had a cruelty designed to enforce mythology. They burned the flesh of any mortal who had been stained with vampire blood. They were a measure of control, of spectacle, and of disdain. The cart stopped at the foot of a flight of steps that led into a hall bigger than any church she had seen as a child. Torches crawled along the walls like living things, and shadows stacked themselves in the corners. Masks watched from balconies. At the top of the throne stairs, where the marble had been buffed to a mirror sheen, the council waited. A ring of faces not quite human, faces that had learned to hide their age behind razor smiles and high collars. Caleb sat on a throne that had been carved from a single sheet of night. He had not aged in the way mortals thought of aging. Rather, time had layered him like the date rings of a tree. Those rings were invisible, but the years lived in him as patient scars. He wore a coat of deep velvet, and his hair fell in a dark fall around a face that had not belonged to any single era. When he rose, the hall breathed as one. Recognition crossed his features before thought could do its slow work. Some things knew their echoes by instinct, the slope of a jaw, the stubborn tilt of a chin. Alina had the same angle to her mouth as the child who had chased smoke on Wren's Hollow's ridge. She had the same furious, uneven stare that did not bend to cosmic law. Her arrival was met with sounds. A ripple of gasps, the cloth of robes whispering, a man's stifled curse. The council's chair, an elder with hair like spun silver, leaned forward, and his voice had the rasp of an old cadence as it addressed Caleb. "High King," he intoned, "you were summoned to rule on this transgression. The Covenant has delivered a leader of rebellion into our hands. This human, Alina Morrow, stands accused of instigating border raids and of binding men with sorcery that defiles the treaty." He tapped a scroll with 3 fingers, as if the law bit him. "Execution." Another voice, colder, came from the shadows. "Public, to remind the valley what happens when humans rise." Caleb's hand brushed the armrest of the throne. For a moment, it seemed he considered the words like a wine glass too bitter. Alina did not speak. She had been taught too well that the court's laws were older than mercy. She had been taught, too, that courage could be a kind of foolish fire. "You have witnesses?" Caleb asked, and his words were not merely judicial. They were searching. The elder nodded. We have evidence. Confessions taken in the light, letters from sympathizers, the chain mark found on raiders who fell in the hollow. Alina's jaw grew tight. They beat the confessions, she said, voice raw as she pulled her shoulders back. They slashed men to make them point at me. They tied my brother to a stake and said he'd be burned if he didn't sing my name. The council flinched as if at a personal insult. One of them, Saren, a lean man who served as Caleb's steward, stepped forward. Saren's expression was a map of practical sympathy. You were taken with proof, he said. We must follow the law. Caleb's eyes found Alina's again. He remembered a child on a ridge, a promise made as though it were a trivial thing. The memory had been a single flare in his long nights, a ridiculous echo of warmth. He had kept it like a talisman, a voice that refused to be swallowed by the centuries. Men died, cities fell, lovers became dust, yet that voice persisted, small and brittle as bones. For all his power, it had remained his strangest human possession. Bring her closer, he said finally. The hall pulsed, servants obeyed. Alina was hauled forward. The silver against her wrists flared, heat licked the skin. She tasted iron and old ash. Up close she could see Caleb's eyes in detail, irises the color of peat, rimmed in tired red, pupils like black ink poured on vellum. He was not as she had imagined, no mask of permanent menace. He wore a solemnity that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with expectation. You remember the child who called me lonely, Caleb said. The council stirred. High King, this is not the time for reminiscence. Alina's lips twitched, a bitter laugh escaped, a single sound that tasted of years. You remember, she said, disbelief folding her features. It could have been a plea or a curse. I remember you. I remember the prince who watched his knights burn other young men. I remember the hands you used like a judge's hammer. Caleb did not flinch. I remember you when your knees were small. His voice was a low thing. You promised me a throne. Her laugh cut again. I promised a silly child's thing. I never wanted your throne. She spit the words like a bitter seed. I wanted, she paused, fingers tightening on the rag of her dress, to make my brother safe. Saren's eyes softened. Tomas Morrow, he asked, her breath hitched. He's gone, she said. Taken by hunters, turned into one of them perhaps, or sold, or worse. I followed them. I did things I'm not proud of, broke into houses, stole blood to pay for people's passage. But I did it for my family. The elder's jaw worked. The council murmured of precedent and punishment. They thought in terms of treaties, documents where ink had replaced empathy. Caleb listened to their arguments, to their dry citations of law, and felt an old machinery grind inside him. The court demanded law because law made the night predictable. The court feared mercy because mercy made monsters less predictable. What do you want, Alina Morrow? Caleb asked, quietly. She looked at him like a shuttered window suddenly thrown open. To go home, she said. To find Tomas, to live. Her voice had the thinness of someone who had survived too much. Do what you do. Don't kill me for wanting life. The council recoiled at the honesty. Punishment, they argued, would be necessary to maintain order. The elder lifted his hand, the sign for finality. The penalty for inciting revolt. Caleb raised a single hand, slower than the old man's. Silence fell as if on cue. He had the authority to enact swift judgment and bend his nobles. He had, in the centuries, learned the weight of his say. Now he used it not as a hammer but as a balancing scale. Not yet, he said. We will not execute a human in the heat of accusation. Hold her in observation. Let the evidence be gathered, and if she is found guilty by our standards, the sentence will follow. The council eyed him sharply, some of those eyes glazed with suspicion. Observation. High King, you set a dangerous precedent. Observation, Caleb repeated, and confinement. He turned then, and when he did, the hall exhaled as if it had been waiting for a sign. She will remain under my charge. Alina blinked, bewildered by relief and fury braided together. A part of her had hoped for death, something final and honest, yet the weight of being kept had its own kind of hunger. Chains were chains, whether made of law or metal. As they led her away, Caleb watched Alina struggle against the shackles. In the private shadow of a corridor, he caught himself remembering the girl's small voice against the cold. "I'll be your queen one day." The words had become less of a child's fancy and more of a promise that haunted him, because it was absurd and human and real. He had, over centuries, learned to deny himself the smaller comforts. He had watched empires rot and lovers betray. He had made decisions that turned the night into a fortress. But something in him, ancient and oddly tender, registered the injustice of a woman beaten into chains who had once said words meant for a playground. Caleb did not know, in that hall of stone and echo, what kept him from signing the scroll that would send Alina to the pyre. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps it was pity, perhaps it was the memory of a child who had laughed at his loneliness. He only knew that the court's law met his loneliness in there, and the law trembled. Alina's glare did not soften when servants led her through the corridors of the palace. She passed beneath tapestries that told stories of the night, heroes, battles, sacrifices, none of which spoke of small girls. The chains clinked, a metallic metronome marking the tempo of a world that did not forgive easily. Yet even as she moved deeper into the belly of the night court, she felt the echo of his remembered kindness like a brand beneath her skin, a mark she could not afford to be soft about. She would not beg. She would not smile on command. She had survived by being relentless. If this was another gauntlet, she would run it on her terms. And if the king, old, patient, the architect of pain and order, would watch, let him watch. Let his memory be a witness. Outside, beyond the court's stony ribs, the moon slid behind a bruise of cloud, and the night held its breath. Inside, the chains tasted of iron and fate. In the center of the court, the shadow of a child's promise stretched long across the marble, an impossible thing that would shape the next act of both their lives. The court kept its secrets in basements. Below the polished marble and the banners that breathed cold air, there were stairways that smelled of damp stone and old wine. The night court's underbelly was a city of veins, tunnels that fed into feeding halls where nobles ate in privacy, cisterns where winter water pooled black as ink, crypts where the bones of founding houses lay in neat, geometric sleep. It was here, amid the business of hunger and memory, that Caleb took Alina to teach her why he ruled and why his rule was fragile. He did not announce the bargain like a monarch bargaining for territory. There was no ceremony, no dramatic flourish, only the economy of a man who had learned to make choices without letting the world see him tremble. In a small, lamplit chamber behind a steward's corridor, he set a cup of thick wine on a low table and sat across from her, as if two exhausted people might trade confidences over a late meal. "You can die here," he said bluntly. "You should be afraid." Alina laughed once, sharp and ugly. "You said the same 20 years ago," she said. "Only then it was other people who died. Your hands were cleaner." Caleb's mouth tightened. "Then I made them clean because my soldiers needed order. Now the order is cracking. There are factions among the hunters. There are rogues among my own. When the treaty frays, the valley bleeds. If the rebellion succeeds, both sides burn." "Why would you care?" she shot back. "You practically engineered the border. You made the bargains so you'd have neighbors to amuse you when the night grew long." "For the sake of the court," he said simply. "Because law kept the worst of us from indulging the worst." He stared into the wine as though it were an enemy. "Because he paused, and something like an old tiredness crept into his words, "have worn the weight of thousands of deaths. I don't want more, not for this." She studied him then, and the mechanical weariness of her anger softened. A clock had wound down somewhere behind his eyes. For a man who could stop a heart with a thought, he had the haunted patience of someone who had been waiting on the world to call its next name for centuries. "What do you want me to do?" she asked at last. Caleb named the terms plainly. She would help him investigate the rising rebel order, move among the border villages without being killed by his own guards, find the men who handled Tomas, follow the money that bribed hunters, and discover which vampires had defected. In return, he would allow her limited freedom. Nights outside the palace with escorts, access to documents, and the promise that if she brought him the truth, he would present her case to the court under his authority. If she refused, the sentence would follow the elder's script. Alina weighed the deal like a coin she knew was counterfeit. She wanted her brother free. She wanted the valley to stop bleeding. She wanted, with the brittle hunger of someone who had few soft things left, to choose her own destiny rather than have it chosen for her. So she agreed. But Caleb withdrew one more clause from within his treasury of caution, a bond. "It is not enough to take your word," he said. "You will be a human in my city. There must be proof you are under my protection." He pressed the table, and a small leather box clicked open. Inside lay a circlet of hammered silver inset with a single small garnet. "Wear this when you cross the gates," he instructed. "It marks you as my concern. It will make other vampires think twice." She glanced at the circlet and the garnet as if at a bed of smoldering coals. "A trinket," she scoffed. "It is a token and a promise," Caleb corrected, "but it is not enough to keep you safe. The court trusts blood more than words. There is a custom among us." He drew back his sleeve, an action that made Alina's skin prickle. His wrist was pale, fine-lined with small veins like a map. "A touch! A pact!" Alina's eyes narrowed. "A pact," Caleb nodded. "A minor sacrament binding only as far as we choose. You prick your finger on this blade and offer a drop to me. I will press my palm to it. The ritual does not make you a vampire. It does not change your life force. It creates a sigil in our eyes, nothing more to your kind, perhaps, but to my people, it will appear that you have been given an offering. It ties you to me in the way a diplomat ties a flag to an embassy." The word *sacrament* landed somewhere between joke and threat. Alina's mouth tightened. She had seen too many men with priestly words cloak their cruelty. But what she wanted, her brother, his freedom, hung beyond the blade. She thought of his laugh, of the blood on hands not yet calloused with age, and the cold fear that had lived beneath the hunter's hands when they took him. She placed her palm on the table with all the steadiness she could assemble. Caleb produced a thin, ceremonial blade, nothing dramatic, and Alina pinched the side of her finger. There was a small spark of white pain, a bead of blood rose. Caleb's hand hovered, almost reverent, above the drop. He lowered his palm and let the blood fall like a tiny coin into his palm. The skin of his hand warmed at the touch of human heat, and for a moment Alina saw a clarity in his face that was not the carefully constructed mask of a ruler. He closed his fingers around the blood, and his knuckles whitened. "You will not be harmed by my guards," Caleb said after a long breath. "They will recognize the sigil on my skin, and they will hesitate. But remember, this bond is trust between us. If you betray me, I will have your head before dawn." She laughed again, softer, a sound like breaking glass. "You think I can betray you, High King? You asked for my help. You will get it." The pact made a small change in the air. The circlet around her wrist sat cool and foreign, a thin line of silver against raw skin. Caleb's palm seemed to retain a faint impression where her blood had touched it, as if the world had accepted the exchange and filed it away under legalities and oaths. The court superstitions had teeth. In an age where prophecy counted for more than kings, this one mattered. Their investigations began that night with a map and a list of names. Caleb guided her through spaces where humans were only allowed when the court wanted them to witness its mercy or its cruelty. Feeding halls lay open to the moon like gutted fish. Servitors carried trays of meat and wine. The nobles who dined there wore masks of velvet and spoke of art and conquest, while fingers dripped with stained reliquaries. Alina watched and learned the rhythms of appetite and etiquette, how one kissed with restraint, how one handled the silverware of power. She was given a caretaker, a young vampire named Lies, slender and hesitant, a court physician by training. Lies's hands were careful when he brought her tea. His questions were softer than Caleb's orders. "They say he remembers," Lies whispered once, leaning against a post where the corridor smelled faintly of rosemary and old blood. "They say he remembers a child who promised him some madness. He's different around you." Alina wanted to snap at Lies. She wanted to believe in her armor of anger. Instead, she found herself listening when Caleb talked about the things immortals could not speak in public. In the hush between patrols, he told her of a few queens who had loved him and had been consumed, metaphorically at first, his voice steady. But then the stories became literal. Lovers who had wilted, whose bodies had succumbed to some slow ash, whose warmth had been sapped not by playful poetry, but by the particular cruelty of his vow. He spoke not to boast, but as confession. "There is a hunger in me that is not always choice," Caleb said once, eyes lost in an inkwell. "I have taken companionship and watched it die. I swore once I would never allow a life to dim because of me. That promise has made me punitive at times, possessive in others. Every queen I have claimed has become a cautionary tale." Alina's jaw clenched. The image of women, gentle, fierce, turning to ash because of a man's curse made something inside her harden. Yet beneath her hardening, a misaligned tenderness stirred. Here was a man who knew the price of closeness and had been trying to pay a debt in solitude. Alina's jaw clenched. The image of women, gentle, fierce, turning to ash because of a man's curse made something inside her harden. Yet beneath her hardening, a misaligned tenderness stirred. Here was a man who knew the price of closeness and had been trying to pay a debt in solitude. Their days became a choreography. Caleb watched, silent and patient, as Alina moved through the border alleys, disguised, taught to speak with a particular cadence to fool suspicious ears. She met with villagers. A widow who sold salted fish, a boy whose feet never seemed to find shoes, an old matriarch who had woven a tapestry of grievances across a lifetime. She learned the ways hunters trafficked in fear, how bribes worked like vinegar, and how promises rotted unless you tended them. She discovered that Tomas's name had been whispered in an inn with a mix of pity and fear, and that he had been seen near a ferry where men without scruples loaded cages in the night. By night, when she returned, she and Caleb traded the currency of small revelations. He told her how treaties were inked in wine and sealed with blood, how his court had once been a place of philosophy and strange beauty before war made its tastes acrid. She told him stories of the ridge, the way the moon had once seemed a bowl the gods had dropped in the valley, how children chased starlight and believed in impossible things. There was a surreal tenderness to their conversations. Two beings on opposite sides of a map, touching the same map where their lives overlapped. One night, Alina woke from a dream in which she had been a child again, standing on the ridge beside Caleb. They were both older in the same dream, an impossible alignment, and she wore a simple crown of woven grasses. He was laughing then, not the small, careful mirth he reserved for private moments, but a laugh unmoored and wide. She woke with the taste of iron on her lips and the faint impression of another hand in hers. When she found Caleb in the corridor, leaning against a carved pillar under a spill of moonlight, she surprised herself by going to him. He did not startle. He turned, and the expression that crossed his face was not hunger but something that looked dangerously like hope. "You dreamed?" he asked. "I did," she admitted, and the admission felt like an offering. "Of the ridge. Of a crown. Of being not afraid." He stepped closer in a way that made her breath hitch, a slow and careful movement. "When I was younger," he murmured, "I thought crowns were answers. The older I got, the more I learned they were just places for people to hang their loneliness." She found herself smiling then, not bitter, not resigned, but soft with the first brittle buds of something else. "Maybe we can hang our loneliness somewhere else," she offered, ridiculousness and bravery braided together. He looked at her as if the suggestion was a map he had wanted to read for centuries. For a moment their distance collapsed, and the palace was only a shell around two people who had accidentally learned each other's geography. The pact had been a contract, the circlet a sign. But the true change came in the hours between, small mercies, nights without pretense, and the slow, dangerous unfastening of defenses. Alina had come into the court angry and made of iron. By the time the moon waned, she had become an alloy, hardened in places but malleable where warmth touched. Blood as trust, that was Caleb's currency, and he had given it back to her as a shield and a mirror. It did not make her his, nor did it make her safe forever. It did ask, quietly and inexorably, whether either of them could endure what the other might become. In a world that measured fidelity by treaties and teeth, they had found another measure, the quiet permission to be vulnerable in a place that habitually forbade it. And as Alina lay awake some nights listening to the palace breathe, she began to understand that the line between monster and man was not always made of fangs and hunger. Sometimes it was the absence of someone else who remembered to keep a promise. The Council of Night kept its counsel like a disease kept in quarantine, out of sight, spoken of only in measured tones, and with the quiet cruelty of instruments. When suspicion flared in a room of immortals, it had the slow-burning heat of peat, no immediate conflagration, but a heat that would work through wood and bone until the foundation softened. The rumor of Caleb's indulgence, of human mercy offered in the private corners of the court, arrived in that quiet way, carried on ink and on the thin tongues of those for whom curiosity was a weapon. Mari's veil's message rode on those tongues like a blade. It was delivered by a rider shrouded in the hunter's brown leathers, stamped with the covenant seal, a hawk grasping both a spear and a broken chain. The messenger bowed at the palace gates and left the rolled parchment with a steward whose hands trembled only in deference. News traveled fast in a city that had nothing else to trade. The council read the letter in the chamber where tapestries swallowed sound and where portraits of past kings watched without judgment. Caleb stood at the window, one hand pressed to the sill as if to hold himself steady against time. He could see the ridge where once a child had stood and issued a ridiculous promise. In the moonlight, it looked smaller somehow, and older people's faces looked like that, compressed into histories they did not own. Saren came in from the corridor, his face drawn. "Mari's claims the woman bears a mark," he said without preamble. "A blood sign. She demands Alina's return for trial by the covenant. She calls it a sacrilege to cross bloodlines." Caleb did not move. He had expected movement like this. The court's muscles were old and remembered to twitch at the right prompt. "A blood sign," he repeated, voice steady as a bell. "On what proof?" "The messenger says villagers swear it, that her brother's fate ties to the old prophecies." "Prophecies," Caleb finished with a hiss that sounded like blown glass. The council members leaned in. Prophecy was a religion they had never wholly trusted. It was a superstition that could unseat a man if enough people chose to believe it. "What prophecy?" The elder unfurled a second scroll, its edges charred and brittle. "There is an old song," he said, fingers feathering the letters as though afraid of waking something. "It speaks of a bridge, of a human born to cross the valley, whose blood will braid with our own to either unite or unravel. It is vague, older than proof, yet the covenant seizes on it when convenient." Alina, who had been confined to a private chamber, now watched like an animal of interest, heard the word asterisk prophecy as if it were an accusation. She felt every eye on her in that hall, predatory, curious, and strangely hungry. Her chest tightened. For weeks she had lived with the tacit assumption that she was only a criminal. Now she was implicated in a myth older than the dead. When the messenger's reply came, it was a demand thinly disguised as diplomacy. Mari's veil demanded Alina be handed to the covenant for judgment and ritual. Caleb's name was used as leverage, bind her in the name of law, or face the hunter's wrath. Caleb read the summons and felt something in his chest twist with the old, familiar dread. He had held courts when entire houses were brought low on lesser charges. He had watched noble blood coagulate into war at a shouting match over land. He knew the mechanics of escalation. A refusal here, a resentful decree there, and the valley could be aflame in a week. He also felt something new, the tiny, unnameable panic that comes from caring for a life you did not think you would ever feel bound to protect. The memory of a little girl's hand had become a line in his anatomy. He could not pretend it did not tug. Caleb called a council meeting that same night, and the chamber filled with faces that had learned to unlove one another. Arguments were made like weapons honed to bureaucratic purpose. Some argued to placate the hunters, to keep the fragile treaty intact. Others argued for standing firm, to assert the court's autonomy, and to remind the valley who truly held dominion over night law. "What if she is the bridge?" a thin-faced duke asked, each word a scalpel. "What if the prophecy gives these humans hope? What if the covenant uses her as a talisman to rally men to their banners?" "Then we must control the talisman," another voice said. "Bind it to us, use it, turn fate into policy." Caleb listened to their silvered philosophies and felt the walls close. In their logic, Alina was no longer a woman but a variable, something to be bound, measured, and deployed. His knuckles tightened on the arm of his throne. When the argument turned to blood, both the metaphor and the literal, Caleb stood. His announcement came not with a king's flourish, but with a weary economy. "She will remain under my protection," he said. "The Covenant will not have her. If they march on the court, we will meet them, but we will not hand her over." The room stilled like a cord cut taut. A dozen breaths held their place. Accusations rose like old ghosts and were smothered by the gravity of his tone. Some bowed and mouthed assent. A few left the hall with their discontent coiled like a serpent in their cloak. In the corridors, whispers grew teeth. Loyalty is a thin thing when measured in centuries, and the nobles had their own appetites. Those who had lost sons to raids, whose grandfathers had died at human hands, felt the sting of a king who could spare a rebel but not their dead. Mari's Veil did not waste time. Her reply was swift and public, a proclamation across the valley that declared Caleb's mercy to be a dangerous softness. She called him a man who remembered a child's promise and who had let sentiment corrupt policy. Hunters across the border ignited with a fever that had nothing to do with law. Men sharpened knives and prayed to gods who ate in the daylight. Caleb watched the fires grow in the valley's reflection on the palace windows. He had choices: to surrender Alina to placate a world that would always be hungry for proof, to fortify the court and let the valley burn in the meantime, or to step forward into a personal crucible and bind his fate to the woman who had once promised him a crown. He chose something no ruler with a functioning court often chose. He chose the precarious architecture of love. The next night, as rain hammered the parapets and the city smelled of wet stone, a messenger returned with a tale of subterfuge. An assassination attempt had been staged, the messenger said. An arrow shot into the parade of servitors, a blade left under a cushion, a whisper meant to split the night. The attempt had a signature, a dark ribbon worn by agents who answered the Covenant's secretive branch. The plot's aim had been unclear, a test, a threat, but the message contained a single terrifying possibility. Someone within the court had leaked information to the hunters. When it became known that the attack followed a council meeting in which Caleb had insisted on Alina's protection, suspicion turned inward like a blade folding on itself. The nobles muttered of traitors and of bloodlines that twined in impossible ways. Caleb's face became an island of calm as he ordered investigations and drummed his guards into heightened watch. Yet in the hollow of his chest, a tentative dread took root. The court was closing in. On a night cracked with thunder, when lightning drew long veins across the sky, the assassination attempt found its moment. It was a ball in the East Wing, an affair of silk and wine meant to distract a court from its worries. Caleb attended because rulers must appear unshaken. Alina had been permitted as a showcase of magnanimity, though many in silence had spat at the idea. Guards were thin in the glittering hall, too sparse for the peace to be wholly enforced. The moment came like a shadow slipping through grammar. A man in a mask, a guest lauded for his wealth, lifted his glass in a toast. Caleb rose to reply. The floor beneath them hummed with music and the smell of crushed roses. Alina stood near a marble pillar, circlet flashing at her wrist like a small, defiant sun. Then there was the sound of a blade sliding a lock, soft as a breath. A figure moved through the hall with the surety of someone who had learned to vanish in crowds. Spears of light from the chandeliers turned that person into a silhouette for a heartbeat. The assassin aimed not at a vulgar noble but at Caleb, where he spoke. Arrows feathered the air, a hand moved to intercept, the music stuttered as if offended. Alina's body reacted before her mind. She moved as she had moved through alleys, with a thief's grace and a sister's ferocity. She darted from the pillar, not to flee but to intercept. Her arm reached in a way neither she nor Caleb expected. The blade found tendon where it had planned for chest. She felt the steel bite and the hot press of blood. It was the kind of wound that would unmake a lesser person, acute, sharp, a perfect punctuation. But Alina did not cry out. Her hand came up to press where the blade had entered. The room filled with a new sound then, a collective breath that was not prayer but withheld grief. Caleb crossed the room in 3 strides, his face a mask that had to eat a tempest. He lifted Alina in his arms like a thing fragile and impossible. Blood spread from her lips in a thin, uncanny line. "You offered yourself," he said, not a question but an accusation that cut more keenly than the blade. The court watched, stunned into a statue of curiosity. For the first time, the nobles saw the woman not as a variable, but as flesh in an immortal's arms, beating and warm. Elena's eyes were clear and ferocious. "I won't watch you die while I stand idle," she said. Her breath was ragged, a small flame about to be smothered. "If I have to be a traitor to the covenant to prove what you won't in words, so be it." Caleb's fingers dug into her side where the wound pooled. He felt the life there, a fierce, stubborn pulse that thrummed against his skin like a second heartbeat. In that moment, something old and desperate and human uncoiled inside him. He could not lose her, not now, not ever. He had watched lovers turn to ash. He had watched promises curdle into myths. If she was to become another cautionary tale, he would make it his final act to reverse the ledger. He did what his form had resisted for centuries. He took her blood, not in the grotesque communion of rape that histories of monsters like to tell, but in a deliberate, sacramental way. He pressed his lips to the cut, not to consume, but to infuse. He let the warmth of her blood bloom against his palate, and then he pressed his palm where the drop had wetted. The sigil the pact had begun years ago flared and ran like ink into the skin. The court gasped at what they saw. Some who had argued for law and order felt their rationalizations shift beneath their feet. To touch blood was to cross an ancient threshold. For Caleb, it was both a vow and a desperation. He poured himself into her wound with the kind of reckless tenderness that had become almost foreign to him. When he finally stepped back, Elena's chest heaved. Her eyes were glazed, as if she had seen beyond the glass. The wound had stopped bleeding as if his touch had sealed it. But the thing the court noticed later was not the healing but the change. A thin, paler line traced down Elena's neck where the blood sigil had taken, luminous in the candlelight. Her pulse was steady, but Caleb felt beneath his own ribs a new rhythm, something not wholly his but not wholly foreign either. Rumors swelled into a flood. The nobles whispered of half-lives, of abominations, of a woman who had touched the king's blood and therefore shared in his curse or his blessing. Mari's veil roared that this violation proved prophecy. A human had intertwined with vampire blood, and the valley's fate was now visible like a wound to the sky. Caleb, who had once renounced such intimacy to spare others, now wore the heavy crown of consequence. He had given her a piece of him, intentionally, irrevocably. He assumed both the mantle of protector and the stain of transgression. In his private thought, there was no calculation of political gain. There was only the raw recognition that he had been given what he had always feared, mutual dependency. Elena, meanwhile, crawled back toward the edge of consciousness. The world around her tilted like a map being folded. She felt inside her the ghost of a heartbeat that belonged to him coiling like a spring, warmth that arrived in a place she had sworn would never be touched by another's inheritance. She had let him taste her blood to save him. She had bound their fates with an imprint that the court, the covenant, and prophecy would now interpret as doom or deliverance. When Caleb learned the precise ways in which the hunters had used her, the riddles of her past that had been coaxed and planted into her life like seeds, rage tempered into a dense, anguished awe. She had not been merely a rebel. She had been guided, groomed, and used as a vessel by men who saw myth as a tool. The betrayal stung, but beneath it was the quieter terror. She had entered his life not by choice but by design, and yet now their lives were knotted together in a way that neither treachery nor law could easily sever. Love, in that shadowed court, had become both a wound and a bridge. It would be the very thing the valley tried to use as proof of their threat, and the very thing that might yet stitch their world back together. The nobles sharpened their tongues. Mari's veil sharpened her spear. Caleb's throne trembled on a line where sentiment and sovereignty crossed like lightning. For Elena, the choice she had made in the chaos of the ball haunted her not because of the bleeding, but because of what it meant to be half of something no one had asked her to be. She had saved him, and in saving him she had given him a bond hotter than iron. She had offered her life, and in return had a piece of his immortality pressed inside her like a second heart. When dawn bled into the sky, the court did not sleep. It argued, plotted, and feared. The council's shadows grew teeth. In the alleys, the hunters sharpened. In bedchambers, the nobles watched the slow burn of a love that would be the ruin of some and the rebirth of others. The court of shadows had revealed a truth no treaty could erase. Love could be a political act. It could be treason and sacrament at the same time. And in the small, private place where Caleb held Alina's trembling hand, it began to feel like both. The valley woke to the sound of iron. Where once morning mists had lingered like indecision, now drums rolled and horns brayed. The hunters had answered Mari's Vale's call. Men and women with faces carved by wind and hunger, banners stitched with the hawk and spear, horses' hooves that beat the earth like proclamations. They came in columns that darkened the road, and with them came a certainty, an intention sharpened by years of grievance and the fuel of legend. On the opposite ridge, the night court readied. Torches were kindled not for warmth but for signal. Cavalry in midnight armor fastened crimson cloaks. Archers checked string and song. Vampires who had lauded the hush of centuries now learned the taste of war in the cold morning air. The treaty, once a wrung-out bargain that managed to keep both sides alive, thrummed like a frayed wire ready to snap. Caleb watched the valley from the palace parapet, the horizon a living seam of men and banners. He did not speak much in these hours. Speaking was a luxury that often settled into tremor. His hands, so used to the small economies of court, were clenched at his sides. The court strategists argued about flanks and forays, but their plans were technicalities against a deeper problem. The heart of the conflict had become personal. Alina's wound, their blood sign, and the assassination's echo had made the valley's anger concrete. In the private rooms beneath the central keep, Alina sat by a narrow window that looked out toward the battlefield. Her face had a pallor that belonged to nights without sleep and to mornings spent with the taste of iron caught in memory. She stared not at the men who marched, but at the small things she had left behind. A threadbare doll, a scrap of Tomas's old scarf. The court had given her tools, maps, escorts. It had not given the one thing she wanted most, her brother. That changed with the report that came like a thrown spear. Tomas lives. The messenger's voice had no flourish. It had the flatness of someone who had been given a fact rather than a gift. He was seen at Fulcrum Bridge, bound in armor, bearing a sigil we know from the Covenant. They call them blood-bound knights. We found one of them's ledger, names of prisoners, names of traitors. Tomas is listed. For a moment, Alina's hands trembled so badly the parchment seemed to swim. The world narrowed until it consisted of one image, her brother's small laugh when he tried to outrun rain. She had imagined him dead, or sold, or lost in the kind of oblivion that had no face. The idea of him alive and bound, made into an instrument of the Covenant, was worse. It was proof that they had used him as bait or as an example. Caleb's face was a cliff of shadow. He had, in private, considered surrender of himself as a bargaining chip. He could walk into the valley, petition to be taken, demand a halt while prisoners were paraded for trade. It was a kingly thing to offer, an abdication of safety for the promise of peace. He imagined the hunters' faces when the immortal came voluntarily into their custody. The power in that image would have been gospel. Alina crushed the idea as soon as she heard it. "You will not surrender to them," she said, voice low and fierce enough to ring in the stone. "You're not a pawn to be sacrificed for our treaties." "It would end the war," Caleb said. His eyes were tired but resolute. "They would have their proof that the king concedes. They would call it a victory and a mercy." "And you would die," she snapped. "You would be placed on a pyre or a cross or some show of human justice, and they would say they had civilized the night." Her hands balled into fists. "No, I will not let you go to bindings meant for criminals." He watched her, and in him something like a tide turned. It was not the logic of political theory that convinced him, but the iron of her certainty. He had often decided for reasons that resembled duty. Now he decided for a reason that resembled love. "Then we go together," he said. The words were small and enormous at once. They would not ride like kings or with the pomp of heralds. They moved under the cloak of urgency. Alina in her circlet, Caleb armored not in velvet but in tempered leather that allowed movement. A few faithful guards accompanied them, those who had not yet decided to turn their loyalties into daggers. The palace doors opened like the lids of a great, inevitable eye, and the two of them stepped out into a valley that felt suddenly intimate and mortal. The field was a map of heat and smoke. Skirmishes dotted the grass like wounds. Banners sagged, and the air carried the stench of blood and fear, of men who had eaten less than a week's sleep. The hunters forgot etiquette in the face of a goal, to take the immortal ruler and make him answer like a man. The vampires forgot their old rules with equal fervor. Their eyes glinted with predatory strategy rather than courtly restraint. They found Tomas near the Fulcrum Bridge not as a free man, but in harness. He was a figure made terrible by circumstance. Once a boy with a crooked grin, now a knight with a helm that hid his face, and a chain that rattled with the rhythm of a bitten drum. His armor bore the Covenant's sigil, a hawk encircled by spear-pointed rays, and his movements had the trained stiffness of a man coerced into obedience. When Caleb stepped forward and Alina cried his name, Tomas's head turned. For a heartbeat, all systems of command failed. A human recognition leapt out of armored steel. Alina's breath broke into a sob that sounded like someone who had been underwater too long. "Tomas," she called, "remember me?" There was no lightening of expression beneath the helm. The knight took a step forward with a soldier's discipline. One of the hunter commanders, broad-shouldered, face a compilation of scars, raised his hand. "Hold, woman," he said. "This one is property of the Covenant." Caleb moved then not like a king, but like a desperate stranger. He put a hand on the commander's arm, a gesture of intervention not wholly diplomatic. "If you would consign a brother to servitude, then let the world see what heart that choice bears," Caleb said, voice even. "Return him to us willingly, and there will be parley." The commander laughed the laugh of men who feel they are holding the better end of a bargain. "We will not parley until the king surrenders. He must stand trial." The argument cooled into tension, then into the roar of directives. Weapons were shifted. The field cooled into a pause that smelled of impending violence. Alina could not abide by words. She stepped into the open, hands empty, and let the world see that the only thing she had was a sister's desperate claim. She walked toward the knight who had once been Tomas, and in doing so she walked toward the hornet's nest of the Covenant's fury. Something in the air changed then, like the shift before a storm. Alina stopped close enough that she could see the line of Tomas's jaw through the visor. It was still his jaw, flattened by training and iron. She reached up, an act that made every person in the valley hold their breath, and touched the cold metal of his breastplate where the Covenant sigil sat. Her hand trembled, but she did not pull back. "Tomas," she whispered, as if speaking his true name could pierce armor. His head tilted, the smallest movement, as if a distant memory brushed his awareness. The commander barked an order, and two hunters stepped forward to restrain Alina. Before they could move, Caleb acted. He had not come to bargain with saber-rattling. He had come prepared for an act that would brand him in new ways. Caleb strode from the line and stood between Alina and the hunters. He removed his cloak, rolling the fabric back to reveal his chest, pale, marked in centuries of old scars and sigils that meant lineage rather than law. He lifted his hand and pressed it onto Tomas's breastplate. "Caleb Varon," he said, weight behind every syllable. "I am the High King of the Night Court. I will not be taken as your hostage for the sake of spectacle." Men shouted, and a volley of arrows arced like sudden birds. The field erupted. The sentence of battle began with the clarity of breaking wave. Alina did not retreat. In the chaos, she darted toward Tomas, who had not moved to stop her. She reached for the clasp of his helm, and with fingers slick and sure, did what she had become adept at. She found the mechanism and forced it open. The face beneath was not the face she remembered, but it was close enough that a gasp tore from her. "Tomas," she said, voice breaking so that it was almost a sound like prayer. For a flicker, his eyes, real human eyes, flickered with recognition. Then the Covenant's training snapped like a harness, and Tomas's gaze slid away as if a cord had been pulled. He moved as an instrument again, not as a brother. The battle surged. Men and vampires clashed with a fury that had no poetry, only the simple arithmetic of survival. Blade, blood, breath. Caleb found himself surrounded by those who sought his head. Alina weaved through pockets of skirmish like a ghost with purpose. At the center of it all, she felt the sigil that bound her to Caleb's pulse beneath her circlet. It vibrated like a small drumbeat tethered to fate. The boundary spell, ancient and cruel, was a thing that gave the valley its edge. It had been woven the day treaties were signed. Obelisks planted at cardinal points, runes etched into stone at river fords, charms buried under altars. It kept two worlds apart not by law alone, but by a gnarly magic that fed on fear and myth. Break the spell, and you might drown centuries of hatred in the same tide. Alina understood in a raw way that made her limbs go numb. This war was not just about land or retribution. It was about the mortar between the stones of their worlds. She had been the tool they used to sharpen that mortar, and perhaps, she dared to think, she could be the wedge that split it. She found the obelisk near Fulcrum Bridge, because the river's crossing had always been a seam. The stone was tall and black, and etched with sigils that thrummed like a trapped heartbeat. It glowed faintly with the old enchantments, and men around it knelt and chanted prayers worn from repetition. Alina's plan was not elegant. It was born of desperation and a ragged courage. She had the circlet, the sigil in Caleb's palm, and the memory of the sacrament from weeks past. To break the spell required a deliberate rupture, the offering of blood and will into the stone's seam, a human act of surrender to unbind a spell that thrived on separation. She knelt at the obelisk's base and set her palms against the carved runes. The stones were cold as sacrifice. Around her, the battle throbbed like a distant storm. She bit the inside of her cheek until blood welled, feeling the tiny white flame of pain. She pressed the wounded spot to the engraved rune and let the blood smear like a signature. At that moment, the sigil in Caleb's hand flared. He had moved to stand at her back as if to guard the act with his body. Alina felt that flare like a recognition, and it steadied her. "You know what this will do." Caleb's voice was a steady weight. "There is no guarantee you return unchanged." "I don't want unchanged," she said. "I want free." She felt the runes drink. Magic objects in the world were not polite. They took and answered in the same breath. The obelisk drank her blood and also the echo of the pact. The runes shivered. Light crawled along the carved seams like insects fleeing the dawn. The other obelisks across the valley felt the change and answered in ghost shrugs of light, the treaty's bones beginning to unpick. For a heartbeat, the air around her seemed to pulse with the possibility of reconciliation. The hunters faltered. Some lowered their spears as if the thing they hated had become suddenly comprehensible. Vampires hesitated mid-lunge, their instincts unsure if the other was prey or kin. It was the hush before change, the blueprint before ruin. Then the cost paid itself. The obelisk recoiled like an animal struck. The energy that had fed on fear now had to rebalance. It reached into Alina, as if the spell sought an anchor, and drew at her blood like a tide pulling back from shore. Heat flared along her veins and exploded behind her eyes. She felt the marrow of her bones ignite and go cool at once. Pain unlatched her like a bolt. Her vision snapped to shards of light. Caleb's arms were under her like the weight of a new world. He felt the burn in her, a fire that was not his pattern and yet had become entangled with the echo of his vidi. The bond they had forged, sacramental and political, had become the hinge by which the old magic would bend. Alina's cry was a torn thing. The battlefield blurred into streaks of color and sound. She saw participants in the clash, faces that merged into constellations of fear. She thought of Tomas, of the ridge where a child had promised a crown, of the nights spent learning the court's private rhythms. She had wanted freedom. She had wanted to be more than the instrument of prophecy. In this moment, the price became clear. To unbind the valley, she might have to unbind herself. Caleb felt an animal panic rise, something older than the customs of nobility. He had never been helpless in a way that meant the other's life ebbed through his fingers. Now, for the first time in centuries, he understood a dread that was not merely seeing an end to power, but the end of the person he loved. He had sworn he would not take another's life through neglect, and now the arc of his cruelty bent the other way. He would not let her die to be noble. He knew then how much he feared not death, but the idea that the world might remember him as the reason another person went to ash. Caleb did what the legends said kings sometimes do in the end of their rule. He offered everything. The ritual of immortality among his kind was not a bargain made in taverns. It was an ancient exchange. Vidi, raw, ancient blood that carried memory, could be given up only if willingly spilled. Caleb had never imagined giving his immortality in full. He had negotiated with centuries as if they were appendages he could unplug at will. But love made his calculus astonishingly simple. He cupped Alina's face with hands that had held war standards and lovers' heads. He leaned in and pressed his lips not to take. This was not the herald's consummation of dominion, but to give. He let his own blood touch the place where her wound had been and where the obelisk's magic had sought an anchor. It was not elegant. It was a slow, deliberate pouring out of what made him what he was. The long, patient sap of nights that contained memory. He transferred it not as a theft, but as a gift and a burden. Each drop he gave was a century unmade. Each breath he surrendered lightened a darkness that had been his and made her warm in a new way. The world around them stilled like an audience that cannot weigh grief in decibels. Men and vampires alike felt the shift. The flow of a monarch's essence away from him and into another was a disruption in the ledger of power. In that transfer, something crucial happened. The vidi answered to the human heart and bound itself to mortality's fragile geography. Alina's body received the blood. For an instant, there was a wild bloom of light, as if the moon itself had drawn closer, and then the light bowed out. The obelisk sighed. The runes across the valley lost their hunger and dimmed. The boundary spell fractured like old glass and dissolved into a mist that settled on the grass rather than a wall that loomed in the sky. But with the spell's shatter came the cost. Alina's chest exhaled like a bell. Her skin grew still in a way that made Caleb's world tilt. Her eyes fluttered closed. The warmth he had given steadied her pulse, but it also carried with it centuries of uncanny charge that had no natural home in a human vessel. She had, in the act of freeing a valley, taken on a burden centuries deep. Caleb felt the irrevocable physics of what he had done. The vidi left him thin in a way that was intimate and mortal. His skin seemed to take on a grain, his reflexes coarser, his senses less precise. Gradually, like a storm moving out to sea, the sharp edges of his immortality dulled. He sighed with a sound like a beginning. Around them, the field changed. The hunters lowered their spears, slower and stunned. Vampires who had borne themselves like an ordered knight drew back in confusion. Tomas, unbound in the sense that chains do not equal mind, slid to his knees and stared at the two people who had made the valley's fate into a wound and a cure. Alina lay in Caleb's arms as the first tentative sun tore a thin thread of gold across the horizon. Her breath came softer now, steady but fragile. She opened her eyes, and for a moment they were clear as a lake. She smiled, small and spent, as if she had walked a great distance and finally found a place to rest. "You did it," she whispered, voice a reed against the morning. Caleb smiled back, a thing made of the oddness of dawn. "You did it," he corrected. "I only followed." They had both given something the other could not return. Alina had burned and yet been kept from the ash by what he had poured into her. Caleb had poured out centuries, and in the spilling become something else. Older in heart but younger in wit. A man who would now learn the particularities of a body that could rust and forget. As the valley quieted, and men gathered themselves like scattered birds, the battlefield became the place of a new kind of covenant. There was no treaty laid on paper that morning that would hold like spells once did. But there was a living testimony. Two figures on a field who had chosen sacrifice instead of supremacy. When they rose simultaneously, Alina steadied by the warmth that was equal parts drain and gift. Tomas moved toward them with a step that felt like re-remembering. The hunters, their victory changed into a show of mercy they had not expected, lowered their banners with confusion, for they had come for a head, and instead they found a dawn. The war did not end that hour. Grudges do not evaporate simply because magic is broken. Men and vampires would argue and barter and heal in ways that took generations. But the boundary between them had been sundered by more than law. It had been sundered by the very thing their myths imagined as impossible, a human and a vampire choosing to share fate. Caleb stood beside Alina as the morning spread. He felt the world differently now. The smell of bread and smoke, the ache of sunlight not filtered by ancient rituals. He met Alina's gaze, and in it lay both the fatigue of sacrifice and the possibility of a new life. "Whatever comes," she breathed, "we do it together." He took her hand in his, no longer a king's iron grip but the steadier, human hold of someone learning to walk with 2 feet instead of centuries. The valley took their first tentative step into a new world. One where dawn would, sometimes, be shared between species, and where love had transformed from a political instrument into the strange, fragile instrument of peace. The world had changed, not through decree, nor the sharp point of a sword, but through the quiet, unyielding will of 2 hearts. Weeks had passed since the battle at Fulcrum Bridge. The field that once ran red with blood now bore the pale shoots of new grass. Where men had fallen, wildflowers bloomed, thin, defiant things that refused to heed the memory of war. The night court stood half in ruin, half in renewal. Broken spires scaffolding under silver beams, crimson banners replaced with new ones stitched in colors of both realms, red for the night, silver for the dawn. The palace no longer echoed with the distant cries of prisoners. The halls had changed their song. They now rang with the sounds of rebuilding, stone meeting stone, laughter mingling with hammer strikes. The scent of blood and smoke had given way to the fragrance of myrrh, lavender, and bread, human scents that had not graced these walls in centuries. At the heart of this slow rebirth lay 2 figures, no longer ruler and captive, but something infinitely rarer. Elena Morrow woke to sunlight. It streamed through tall, arched windows draped in pale curtains that whispered like ghosts of silk. She blinked against the light, her lashes trembling as memory returned. The battle, the obelisk, the burn of blood. Her fingers moved instinctively to her chest. Beneath the linen bandages, her skin was unbroken save for a small, crescent-shaped scar, the mark of where Caleb's essence had entered her heart. It pulsed faintly, a rhythm both her own and not. For a long time, she simply breathed. Each breath tasted of the living world, of warmth and air untainted by the metallic tang of blood magic. It was a fragile, human breath. The door creaked open softly. Caleb stepped in, sunlight trailing him like an uncertain friend. Gone was the armor, the mantle, the crown of onyx. His once pale skin held a faint golden undertone now, as if sunlight had claimed him at last. There was weariness in his eyes, yes, but also a quiet wonder. He carried no scepter, no blade, only a bowl of clear water and a small sprig of moonflower freshly cut. Elena smiled weakly. "You look different." He set the bowl on her bedside table, the faintest smile touching his lips. "I am. It seems mortality suits me poorly. I bruise, I tire, I hunger in new ways." Her laughter came like a ripple in still water. "Then perhaps you'll finally understand us fragile creatures." Caleb's gaze softened as he knelt beside her bed. "Fragile," he murmured, "is the word the immortal use when they cannot name courage?" He reached for her hand, and when their fingers met, something warm spread between them, not magic, not enchantment, but the steady pulse of shared humanity. Later, they walked together through the rebuilt halls of the night court. Where once iron rings had held prisoners, now hung lanterns carved from moonstone and silver. The scent of candles replaced that of blood. The very walls seemed to breathe differently, lighter, less haunted. Vampires and humans moved side by side, masons, scholars, healers. The council, once a rigid assembly of pale, cold faces, now stood uncertainly at the great staircase, watching their king approach with the human woman who had broken their world and remade it. As Caleb and Elena entered, silence rippled like wind through long grass. One by one, the counselors bent their knees, not to crown or lineage, but to the act that had changed everything. A murmur swept through the chamber, reverent, unsure, awed. "The king who gave up eternity," one whispered. "And the woman who gave it meaning," said another. Elena's fingers tightened around Caleb's. She didn't feel like a queen. Not in the way stories meant it. She was simply a woman who had made an impossible choice and survived it. Yet when she looked upon those gathered, vampire and human alike, she saw what the world could become, not divided realms, but one dawn. She turned to Caleb, eyes glimmering in the soft light. "I told you," she whispered, her voice trembling with something between laughter and tears. "I'd be your queen one day." Caleb looked at her for a long moment, the corners of his lips curving into the smallest, truest smile. "And I," he said softly, his voice like the slow rise of a tide, "yours." That night they stood on the balcony overlooking the valley. The moon hung low, mirrored by the first light of approaching dawn. It was the same ridge where, 20 years ago, a child had once spoken to a shadowed king and promised him love. Alina leaned against the balustrade, the wind threading through her hair like invisible fingers. Caleb stood beside her, the faint warmth of his mortal body brushing against hers. The horizon began to shift, black fading to blue, blue to pale rose. The first rays of dawn crept across the land, touching the ruins, the fields, the graves, and the newly laid foundations. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked quietly. "The centuries, the power." Caleb's gaze followed the light. "No, for the first time I know when something begins and when it ends. That makes it precious." He turned to her, the dawn haloing his face. "Eternity was a cage made of gold. You broke it." Alina reached up and touched his cheek. "Then let's live while we have time." And so they stood together as the sun breached the horizon, its light spilling over them, turning silver to gold, shadow to warmth. For the first time in 1,000 years, the night court saw the dawn not as an enemy, but as a promise. In that quiet, eternal moment, the past was forgiven. The chains had become symbols, the curse had become blessing. And as the light touched them both, their shadows merged into one. The world had forgotten the wars, but not the song. It began as a whisper among storytellers and scholars, carried from tavern to temple, from cradle to grave. The tale of the Queen of Dawn, the mortal girl who loved the vampire king, and in doing so, broke the oldest curse. Generations passed. The kingdoms of men and the courts of night no longer bore the names they once did. Borders faded into memory. What remained were the bridges, both stone and spirit, that bound the living to the once feared shadow. It was a world reborn under two suns, one of day, one of memory. On the ridge of Wren's Hollow, where the last battle had once scorched the earth, a child stood watching the sunrise. The boy could not have been older than 10. His hair caught the dawn like pale fire, and his eyes, deep as dusk, reflected both light and shadow. In his hands he held a small, carved pendant, a crescent entwined with a drop of red crystal. Behind him, the valley sprawled wide and green. Where once soldiers had clashed, now stood orchards, villages, and quiet rivers. Children of both bloodlines, human and nightborn, played side by side, their laughter scattering across the fields like seeds. The boy's grandmother had told him the story the night before. She'd spoken of a queen born mortal and a king who gave up eternity, of a love so fierce it made dawn out of darkness. "She returned in chains," she had said, her voice a trembling flame, "but left the world unbound." He hadn't understood the words then, but standing there now, watching the sun rise over the ruins below, he thought he might. The old night court lay in silence beneath the valley, its spires long broken, its walls softened by moss and ivy. Nature had reclaimed what war once defiled. Yet deep within the central hall, two thrones still stood, side by side. No vine dared touch them, no dust settled upon them. One was carved from obsidian, streaked faintly with veins of red, the throne of Caleb Varan, the last immortal king. The other was of pale marble, cracked with time but gleaming still beneath the light that poured through the shattered ceiling, Alina Morrow's seat, the mortal queen who had changed the shape of history. On the stone between them, faint words shimmered, etched by hands long gone but magic everlasting. She returned in chains, but left the world unbound. Two bloods, one song. The child descended the ridge slowly, drawn by something he could not name. Birds scattered as he walked through the tall grass, the wind carrying the faint scent of rain and wildflowers. When he reached the ruined gate, he paused, listening. For a heartbeat, the air shifted. He heard it then faint and far, as if rising from the stones themselves, a melody woven from two voices, one light, one dark. It was neither human nor vampire, neither prayer nor lament. It was a song of memory, of love that defied its nature. The boy closed his eyes. The melody wound through him, soft and timeless. The song of the queen who had walked through death to bring life, and the king who had traded forever for a single dawn. When he opened his eyes again, the light had changed. The ruins no longer looked broken, only sleeping. He placed his pendant at the foot of the twin thrones, bowing his head. "Thank you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure why. As he turned to leave, the first drops of morning rain began to fall, striking the stone with gentle rhythm. The sound mingled with the unseen song, each drop like a heartbeat echoing through centuries. By evening, the child was gone, but the pendant remained, glimmering faintly where the last beam of sunlight touched it. Night fell, and when the moon rose over Wren's Hollow, its light spilled across the twin thrones, filling the hall with silver fire. For just a moment, two silhouettes appeared, faint and soft as breath, seated side by side. One with hair of shadow and eyes of crimson, the other crowned in light, her gaze turned toward the stars. They said nothing. They didn't need to. The silence between them was peace. Then, like mist before dawn, they vanished, leaving only the echo of their song drifting through the ruins. A song that spoke of what they had once been and what the world had become because of it. Generations later, the scholars would call it the Song of Two Bloods. The poets would claim to hear it on quiet nights when the moon and sun shared the sky. Lovers would carve crescents into tree bark and whisper oaths beneath their breath, hoping the Queen of Dawn might bless them. But in truth, the song belonged to no one and everyone, a reminder that the world was healed not by conquest, but by compassion. That love, once forbidden, had rewritten the laws of night and day. And that somewhere, beyond the reach of time, two souls still watched over the dawn they had created.